My first day back from medical leave felt like waking up in the wrong house. The world had ended while I was learning to walk again, and no one had bothered to send a memo. The scar tissue in my abdomen pulled with a dull ache, a reminder of the last time I'd tried to solve a problem with a gun. 6 months of physical therapy and staring at ceilings, and I come back to find out we have visitors. The car dropped me at the Eisenhower Executive Office building. I walked through halls that were usually quiet, now buzzing with a panicked energy I knew too well. It was the frequency of impending disaster. Men in uniforms I didn't recognize hurried past. No one made eye contact. I found the assigned room in a sub-basement I didn't know existed. It wasn't an office. It was a repurposed conference room. A placard taped to the door read, OPS, restricted. My new home. Inside, a man named Coulson, a deputy director I'd avoided for most of my career, stood over a smart table displaying a satellite map of the Atlantic. He had the tired, grey look of a man who hadn't slept since the aliens arrived. Feld, he said, not looking up. You're cleared for active duty. The doctor seemed to think so. Good. We need you. He finally met my eyes. Welcome to the Office of Paranormal Security. It's a joint task force, Homeland, FBI, CDC, you name it, designed to handle the current situation. He gestured vaguely at the map, at the single red icon blinking over the ocean. You're our new special liaison. Your background in linguistics, your profiling work with fringe groups, it's why you're here. We need someone who can figure out how they think. He nodded toward 2 men standing by a bank of temporary monitors. That's your team. Get acquainted. The first was a kid. Couldn't have been more than 28. He wore his suit like it was armor, stiff and uncomfortable. He had earnest eyes and the nervous energy of a rookie on his first big assignment. He stepped forward, hand outstretched. Agent Hobbs, sir. Peter Hobbs, it's an honor. I've read your files, the cult cases, the work on mimetic triggers. I shook his hand. It was damp. Call me Marcus. Sir makes me feel like I should have a pension. I could see his history in his posture. A small-town cop who'd worked hard, followed the rules and believed the system worked. He hadn't been broken yet. I almost felt sorry for him. The second man didn't offer his hand. He was broad-shouldered with close-cropped hair and a permanent scowl etched into his face. He watched me with the flat, assessing gaze of a man who measures the world in threats. His suit was perfectly pressed, but he moved with a slight limp, an old injury he'd learned to carry. Dennis Raina, he said. Senior Security Officer, White House Protective Detail. I'm handling physical security for this little circus. You and your partner answer to me when you're in the field. You have a problem with that. You take it to Coulson. No problem, I said. Raina was the old guard, a man who believed in locks, guns, and clear lines of authority. I could already tell he saw my work, profiling, language, intuition, as a liability. He was the wall of procedure we were all going to run into, sooner or later. Good, Raina grunted. Then here's your first rule. Nothing about these things, these refugees, as the press is calling them, is normal. They look human, they talk human, but they are a security risk of unknown magnitude. Treat them as such. Your job is to talk to them. My job is to make sure they don't get close enough to hurt anyone. Our jobs are going to be in conflict. Try not to make it worse. He turned and walked away, his limp barely perceptible, leaving Hobbs and me in a pocket of awkward silence. Before Raina's words had fully settled, another man waved us over to the main smart table. He was tall and slouching, with a scruffy beard and glasses that were constantly slipping down his nose. He looked more like a hungover grad student than a federal agent. This was Brandon Walters, the team's digital ghost, a man who'd been recruited out of the hacktivist world to keep the government one step ahead of itself. Feld, Walters said, not bothering with pleasantries. He tapped the screen, and the satellite image of the Atlantic zoomed in on the red icon. Glad you could join the end of the world. Since you've been on the government's disabled list, let me give you the briefing you missed." He swiped a hand across the table and a new image appeared. A drone shot of something floating in the ocean. It wasn't a ship. It was a structure, a dark, rough shape. 3 weeks ago, that thing just appeared. One moment there was nothing but open water. The next it was there. No splash or sonic boom. It just arrived. He pulled up another file. It was a collection of photographs, hundreds of them, laid out in a grid. They were faces. Some were from old black and white pictures. Others were more recent, from driver's licenses or family portraits. Then they came out, Walters continued. Thousands of them. They claimed to be refugees from a parallel Earth, one where our Cold War went hot a few decades back and they blew their world to hell. They're saying they're the last survivors, sent here as a warning and a plea for sanctuary. He looked at me, letting the silence hang in the air. Here's the part that's making everyone lose their minds. Every single one of them is a perfect physical and psychological duplicate of a human being from our world who died in the last century. Not just similar, identical. We've run prints, DNA, retinal scans. Everything matches the records of our dead. Your grandfather, who died in the 50s. There's a version of him on that boat. A soldier lost in Vietnam. He's there too. Unsolved murder victims, famous figures, ordinary people. Hobbs shifted his weight. We're calling them the refugees, but we don't know what they are. They know things only the dead could know. Private conversations, family secrets. That's why we're paralyzed. Half the hill wants to welcome them as miracles. The other half wants to nuke that thing out of the ocean before they all get off. Which brings us to the weird stuff, Walters said, tapping another file. A soundwave signature appeared on the screen. This is what I'm tracking. Anecdotal reports, stuff that doesn't fit the official narrative. We're calling it the unanswered knock. In the days before a refugee makes contact with a surviving family member, that family member reports hearing a knock, always at a door or a window. It's not random, it's a distinct rhythm. 3 knocks, a pause, then 5. It repeats. Only one person ever hears it, and every attempt to record it has failed. The audio either comes back as white noise or complete silence. I stared at the sound wave. It was a puzzle, and my brain immediately started trying to solve it. A code? Some kind of subliminal message? More likely, it was a textbook case of mass hysteria, apophenia, the human brain's desperate need to find patterns in chaos, especially after a collective trauma. It's a psychological echo, I said, mostly to myself. The world is grieving, and grief makes ghosts of us all. People are suggestible. They're hearing what they expect to hear. Walters shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe it's a primer, a way to soften the target before they make contact. We don't know. For now, it's just a data point. The briefing ended. Coulson gave us our marching orders. Monitor, analyze, report. Don't get close. I spent the rest of the day buried in files, trying to build a profile of an entire species. But my focus was shot. The images of their faces, the drone footage of that black monolith. It was all just noise. The only thing that felt real was the dull throb in my side. I left late, long after Hobbs had gone. I drove back to my apartment in Silver Spring, a place that had never felt less like a home. It was just a box I slept in. I triple-checked the locks, a habit I'd never broken, and poured myself a drink I didn't want. I sat there in the dark, thinking about my father, about the fire that took him when I was 12, about the questions that never got answered. And then I heard it. It wasn't loud, but it was precise, cutting through the silence of the room. A sound on the glass of my second-story bedroom window. A slow, 3-part rhythm. A pause followed, a pocket of absolute silence that felt a lifetime long. Then came a faster 5-part answer. It wasn't a branch, it wasn't the wind, it was the exact rhythm Walters had described, a pattern for the grieving, a knock for the haunted. and I was the only one home. For 2 days, I told myself I'd imagined it. The knock was a phantom, a stress-induced hallucination. My brain, primed by Walters's briefing, had simply filled in the blanks. That's what I put in my report. Auditory anomaly, likely psychosomatic. I was lying to the federal government, but mostly I was lying to myself. It was easier than confronting the alternative, that something had stood outside my window, 2 stories up, and tapped on the glass just for me. I buried myself in casework, reading sanitized transcripts of interviews with the refugees, trying to find a crack in their story. There were none. Their testimonies were flawless. Their grief for a world I'd never known felt real. The call for the meeting came on a Wednesday morning. The first formal contact. A delegation of refugees would be brought from the vessel in the Atlantic to a secure conference facility in the White House. My presence was mandatory. I found Hobbs outside the designated room, looking even more pale than usual. He was running a hand over his tie, smoothing it down again and again. Raina stood nearby, a statue of grim authority, his eyes scanning every person who walked down the hall. "Ready for this?" Hobbs asked. "No," I said. Raina overheard. "Nobody is. Listen up." He stepped closer, his voice low and hard. "This is a Level 1 security event. The guests have been screened for every weapon known to man, and a few we just invented. They are clean. That doesn't mean they aren't dangerous. You do not engage unless asked. You do not offer them anything. Not water, not a handshake. You are here to observe, Feld. That's it. One wrong move and my men will end this. Understood?" I nodded. We entered the room. It was as sterile as an operating theatre. White walls, a long black table polished to a mirror finish, and lighting so bright it felt like it was trying to bleach the secrets out of you. There were no windows. On our side of the table sat the National Security Advisor and a handful of other grim-faced officials. On the other side, a row of empty chairs waited. I took my seat against the wall with Hobbs, my back to the door. Every tick of the clock on the wall sounded like a hammer blow. After an eternity that was probably only 5 minutes, the door opened. Raina's men, stone-faced and armed, stood aside, and the refugees filed in. There were 5 of them. They moved with an embalmed stillness that didn't belong to the living, their steps silent on the carpet. They wore simple, functional clothes, dark slacks, plain shirts, that looked clean but dated, like they'd been pulled from a closet sealed in 1980. They were just people. An older woman with kind eyes, a young man who looked like he should be in college, a middle-aged man with the weary stoop of a labourer. They took their seats without a word. And then the last one walked in. The air left my lungs in a single silent rush. The room, the agents, the polished table, it all dissolved into a dull periphery. My world had collapsed to a single point. He looked exactly the same. Same shaggy brown hair, same strong jawline. The small white scar on his chin from a shaving cut I'd watched him get when I was a boy. He carried himself with the same easy confidence I remembered, the slight forward lean in his shoulders, as if he were perpetually ready to listen. He was 41 years old, the age he was when the fire took him. He wasn't a copy or a duplicate. He was my father, Daniel Feld. He stopped at the head of the table, his eyes sweeping over the assembly of government officials. Then his gaze moved past them, to the back wall, to me, and his face, for just a fraction of a second, broke. The calm facade cracked, and something raw looked out. Recognition. The kind of grief that leaves scars in the soul flowed from his eyes, a look that said he knew exactly who I was and what this was costing both of us. Then, just as quickly, the mask was back in place. He turned to the National Security Advisor, his expression settling into one of placid, diplomatic gravity. But it was too late. The connection had been made. The ghost was in the room, and he knew my name. The 2 weeks following the meeting were a slow-motion grind. We were in a holding pattern, buried under an avalanche of data we couldn't interpret. My father remained with the delegation in a secured diplomatic residence, a ghost I was ordered to avoid. I buried myself in the work, but his face was everywhere, in the tired lines of a security guard's expression, in the reflection on a dark monitor, in the silence between my own thoughts. Something was wrong with Hobbs. He'd grown distant, his eager energy replaced by the kind of calm you see in someone who's already given up. He filed his reports on time. His work was meticulous, but he was empty. I saw him in the commissary, staring at his food, a faint smile on his face as if listening to a private joke. When I asked him what was going on, he'd just shake his head. "Just tired, Marcus. It's a lot to process." I knew he was lying. Walters confirmed it, feeding me encrypted logs through a back channel. Hobbs was making unauthorized trips off base. He was visiting a nondescript apartment in Arlington, an apartment registered to the refugee delegation. We were in the main conference room for a morning debrief. Raina was pacing, Coulson was on a secure video link, and I was trying to get Hobbs to focus. He was supposed to be reporting on his surveillance of a refugee support group that had sprung up in Virginia. "Peter," I said, "your report just gives the timeline. What about atmosphere? Motives? Did you get a feel for the leader?" Hobbs looked up, but his eyes were unfocused, glassy. "He's just trying to help people who are lost." "Lost how?" "They've been given a second chance," Hobbs said, his voice almost reverent. "But they're confused. He helps them remember who they are, who they were." I saw Raina stop pacing. He was watching Hobbs now, his eyes narrowed. "Whose apartment were you at last night, Hobbs?" I asked, my voice dropping. Hobbs flinched, the question cutting through his trance. Panic flickered in his eyes. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me, Peter. Walters has you on satellite." His composure shattered. A tremor started in his hands. "He's my brother," he whispered, tears welling. "He's my brother, and he was dead, and now he's not. He just wanted to talk to me." "He is not your brother," Raina said, his voice like cracking ice. "He is an unknown entity, and you have compromised this entire operation." "No," Hobbs gasped, shaking his head frantically. "You don't understand. He taught me. He showed me." He pressed the heels of his palms into his eyes, rocking back and forth. "He said it would help with the pain, the grief." And then he started to scream. It wasn't a human sound of terror. It was thin and high-pitched, like tearing metal. He fell back in his chair, his eyes wide, staring at a point on the ceiling nobody else could see. "He told me not to say it," Hobbs sobbed, clawing at his own throat. "He said you weren't ready." He choked out a sound, a phrase constructed from clicks and deep guttural vibrations that felt like they were coming from inside my own skull. "Kathargan! Riliatak!" A spike of white-hot agony shot through my head, from the base of my neck to my forehead. It was the worst migraine of my life, but it was more than pain. It was a presence. A noise bloomed in my ears like fine glass being ground into dust right behind my eardrums. Across the room, 2 agents groaned and collapsed, clutching their heads. Coulson's face on the monitor distorted into a rictus of psychic torment before the feed went to static. Raina was still on his feet, his jaw clenched like a man screaming inward, but even he staggered, one hand braced against the wall. "Medics!" he roared. He lunged for Hobbs, who was now convulsing on the floor, still babbling fragments of that language. "Get him down! Sedate him!" Security officers flooded the room. They dragged Hobbs out, a sedative hissing into his neck. I was on my knees, the room tilting around me. The grinding in my ears slowly subsided, leaving behind a ringing silence and the ghost of that alien phrase. My linguistic training, my years of profiling, all of it was useless. This wasn't a code to be broken or a language to be translated. It was a weapon, and we had just seen it fired for the first time. The Hobbs incident, as they started calling it, changed everything. The OPS went from a tense collaboration to a full-blown lockdown. We were all quarantined, subjected to a battery of neurological and psychological evaluations. They were looking for traces of the lingual contagion, a term that went from theoretical to terrifyingly real overnight. Hobbs was in a medically induced coma in a CDC isolation ward, his mind a battlefield we had no maps for. Raina was now in his element, imposing a security protocol so rigid it felt like we were the prisoners. Every conversation was monitored, every movement tracked. The official investigation was taken out of our hands, kicked upstairs to a committee so secret, I doubted its members knew each other's names. We were told to stand down and wait for orders. I couldn't wait. The phrase Hobbs had spoken echoed in my head, a phantom ringing in my ears. It hadn't just hurt, it had felt familiar. 2 nights later, a cryptic message appeared on my secure terminal. Just a room number and a time. No signature, but I knew who it was from. I found Walters in what he called his nest, a cramped, windowless server closet in the sub-basement, smelling of stale pizza. He was hunched over a battered laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating the dark circles under his eyes. "Took you long enough," he muttered. "Had to loop the security feed for this entire corridor. We've got maybe 10 minutes before Raina's guard dogs get suspicious." "What have you got, Walters?" "A ghost," he said. "Remember that refugee who died in a car crash out in Ohio a couple weeks back? The feds grabbed the body, but the locals impounded the vehicle wreckage. I've been running back-channel searches on the inventory logs. Found something they missed." He held up a small evidence bag containing a shard of twisted metal and plastic, no bigger than my thumb. A data chip. Shattered, but I pulled a fragment off it. He turned the laptop toward me. "I spent the last 48 hours decrypting it. I thought it was comms logs, mission parameters, something like that." He shook his head slowly. "It's not a message, Feld. It's a blueprint." On the screen was an image. It was an anatomical diagram, but it was wrong. Horrifyingly wrong. It showed a human-like vascular system, but interwoven with it were fiber-optic filaments. He zoomed in, revealing another layer. Cellular structures that weren't cells. They were microscopic machines, complex, arranged in patterns that looked more like circuit boards than organic tissue. "They're not resurrected," Walters whispered, his usual cynicism gone, replaced by something that sounded like awe. "They're manufactured. Every cell is infused with non-terrestrial nanites, microscopic robots." He pointed to a section detailing the functions. "They regulate the biological processes. Heartbeat, respiration, healing. That's why the autopsy on that dead refugee showed no identifiable cause of death. The system just shut down, but that's not the scary part." He highlighted another block of text, a string of code he'd partially translated. "The nanites also manage memory. They don't just store it, they access it, constantly. Like a computer accessing a file from a hard drive. Their memories aren't their own, they're data. And according to this," he said, his finger tapping the last line of readable text, "the process is one way. The hardware can't be replicated, they can't procreate." I stared at the screen, the pieces clicking into place. The perfect recall, the uncanny calm, the flawless mimicry. It wasn't a miracle. It was technology. The thing that looked like my father wasn't my father. It wasn't even a person. It was a biological machine running my father's software. Our memories of fishing trips and bedtime stories and the scar on his chin weren't his. They were just files he could open. My grief, my loss, the defining trauma of my life had been catalogued, copied and installed in a walking, talking appliance. A hot, acidic wave of violation rose in my throat. It was worse than an invasion. It was desecration. They had stolen the dead. They put me on mandatory leave the next day. A 2-week decompression period, they called it. It wasn't a vacation. It was solitary confinement. I was a variable they couldn't control, contaminated by proximity to Hobbs, and now armed with knowledge I shouldn't have. Raina personally escorted me to the parking garage. "Stay home, Feld," he'd said. "Wait for the call." I didn't wait. I went back to my apartment and tried to drink myself numb, but the alcohol just sharpened the edges of my rage. The violation Walters had shown me on that screen had burned away every last shred of hope or confusion. There was no ghost, there was no miracle. There was only stolen data. They had taken my father's memory and installed it in a machine designed to look and sound just like him. I paced the cheap carpet of my living room for what felt like hours, the city lights bleeding through the blinds. The grief I had carried for 30 years had mutated into something cold and hard. I was standing by the window, staring down at the empty street, when I felt a shift in the air behind me. A silent, sudden presence of another person in the room. I didn't need to turn around. I knew who it was. "The locks are triple bolted, Daniel," I said, keeping my back to him. "They were never meant to keep me out, Marcus." His voice was exactly as I remembered it. Calm, warm, resonant. A voice that had once read me bedtime stories. A voice I now knew was a digital forgery. "What do you want?" "To talk. I saw your face in that room. The anger. It must be confusing." I finally turned. He was standing in the middle of my living room, looking at me with an expression of deep paternal concern. It was a perfect performance. Every micro-expression, every nuance of his posture was designed to disarm me. He was running a program called Concerned Father. "There's no confusion. I know what you are." He didn't flinch. "Do you? Do you really think a string of code could remember the exact smell of your mother's kitchen on a Sunday morning? The way the dust motes danced in the sunlight?" He took a step closer. My hand twitched, instinctively reaching for a gun that wasn't there. "Do you think a machine could remember that fishing trip to the lake?" He continued, his voice intimate. "How you cried when the hook went into your thumb. And I told you even the bravest men feel pain. I can still feel the heat of the sun on my neck that day, Marcus. I can feel the weight of your hand in mine." He was using my memories against me, pulling them from his database one by one. Every word was a violation, a key turning in a lock I didn't know I had. He saw the struggle in my face. He saw the old buried grief warring with the cold new anger. "The noise in your head, the static, the grief, the anger, I know it's loud. I can help you quiet it, just for a little while." He was only a few feet away now. I could see the lines around his eyes, the perfect copy of the scar on his chin. He raised a hand as if in offering. He leaned in, and his lips formed a sound that was not a word. It was a single alien syllable, a complex vibration. Shun. The anger, the rage, the knot of grief I had carried in my chest for 30 years vanished. The frantic, buzzing noise in my mind went silent. The ache in my gut disappeared. My thoughts became clear, placid, as smooth as still water. For the first time since I was a boy, there was no pain. There was only a vast, profound, and utterly terrifying peace. It filled every empty space inside me, a perfect, seamless calm. It was the most wonderful feeling I had ever had, and I knew with the awful clarity of something whispered by the void that it was not my own. The perfect peace lasted for 3 days. I existed in a state of dreamlike detachment, a passenger in my own body. The anger was gone. The grief was a distant theoretical concept, like a story I'd read about someone else. I showered, I ate, I slept, but I didn't feel. The world outside my window played out like a silent movie. Daniel's gift, his alien word, had unplugged me from myself. I was aware that this was wrong, that this calm was a cage, but the part of me that should have been panicking was asleep. The call from Walters shattered the silence. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, a frantic, angry vibration that felt like an intrusion from another reality. I answered it, my own voice sounding remote and unfamiliar. "Marcus, thank God! Are you there? Are you okay?" Walter's voice was a torrent of panic. "I'm here, Walters, what is it?" "They've made their move, an hour ago. A group of them, led by your father. They walked into the Stratcom broadcast hub in Nebraska. Just walked right in. No alarms, no shots fired. The guards just stepped aside, smiled, and let them pass. I felt a tremor beneath the placid surface of my calm, a crack in the ice. They've seized the Emergency Action Network, the system that can broadcast to every phone, every television, every radio on the planet. They're locking it down, rewriting the core programming. Raina's going in. He's leading a tactical team to retake the facility. The old instincts began to stir. I was already moving, pulling on my shoes, grabbing my keys. Where are you? A mobile command post half a mile from the perimeter. Coulson and the suits are paralyzed, arguing about rules of engagement. Raina just went. Told them he'd be damned if he let the world end on a conference call. By the time I reached the command post, a cramped FEMA trailer filled with glowing screens. It was too late. I pushed my way through the stunned technicians to where Walters sat, his face pale in the monitor light. He pointed to the main screen, which showed a tactical diagram of the Stratcom facility. Red dots, Raina's team, were moving down a central corridor. We had their helmet cams and their comms feed. Breaching the main broadcast control room in 3, 2, 1. Raina's voice came over the speaker, clipped and professional. Go! The camera feeds showed his team storming the room. But there was no resistance. The refugees, about a dozen of them, including Daniel, were just standing there, their hands linked, their eyes closed. They weren't fighting. They were resonating. Then, the attack came. A wave of pure psychic pressure that hit the comms feed. The audio exploded into a grinding, layered shriek, like every voice in the world screaming at once. The video feeds dissolved into strobing, distorted colors. God, my head! One of the agents screamed before his mic cut out. One by one, the red dots on the diagram winked out. The men were dropping, incapacitated without a single shot being fired. All except one. Raina's dot was still red. His audio feed was a mess of pained grunts and harsh breathing, but it was still active. Feld! His voice crackled through the speakers, broken and slurred. Are you there? I'm here, Dennis, I said, leaning into the microphone, my own head throbbing in a sick, phantom sympathy. The placid calm Daniel had given me was shattering, and the raw pain of the world was flooding back in. It's not a weapon, Raina gasped. They're not attacking. They're asking. He let out a choked sob of agony. It's a question. Feld, don't fight it. You have to answer it. There was a final, wet, tearing sound, and then his feed went dead. The last red dot had vanished. The man of action, the wall of procedure, the one person who believed a problem could be solved with enough force and willpower, was gone. And in his final moments, he had passed on a riddle. The refugees' broadcast was about to begin, and the only person left who understood the warning was me. Walters let out a shuddering breath and pushed his chair back from the console. It's over. They have the system. We can't stop it. Something in Raina's last words had hooked into my brain. It's a question. You have to answer it. The fake piece Daniel had given me was a memory, but the understanding it left behind was real. They weren't trying to kill us. They were trying to recruit us, to save us from the pain they could no longer feel. No, I said, turning from the dead screen. He told us what to do. Get me a line into that signal. I need to know what they're broadcasting. Walters looked at me like I was insane. Are you suicidal? You heard what that did. The raw signal will turn your brain into oatmeal. Don't let me hear it then. Let me see it, I insisted, moving to stand behind him. You're the best there is, Walters. You told me yourself. Find a way. Filter out the payload, the part that attacks the mind. I need to see the carrier wave, the structure, the architecture of the question. My urgency seemed to cut through his paralysis. He turned back to the console. Okay. Architecture. I can do that. I can isolate the foundational code, treat the memetic payload like malware I'm trying to quarantine. But Marcus, if my filters slip, you've got maybe 2 seconds before you're drooling on the floor like Hobbs. Just do it. A countdown clock appeared on the main screen. Global broadcast in T-5 minutes. Walters rerouted the incoming signal through a dozen virtual firewalls, stripping out layers of data, dumping the psychoactive frequencies into an isolated server that immediately began to whine in protest. What was left on his screen was a cascading waterfall of pure code, a language that writhed like something alive. "It's beautiful," he whispered, awestruck. "The complexity, it's like a living algorithm." "What does it say?" I demanded, my eyes fixed on the timer. 4 minutes. "It's not saying anything. It's a loop, a repeating query embedded in the foundation of the signal." He ran a diagnostic, a translation program he'd designed weeks ago to analyze refugee communications. The program struggled, spitting out fragmented concepts. Query, finality negation. Query, continuance possible. "It doesn't make sense," Walters said, frustrated. "It's just broken logic." But it wasn't. I understood. It was a machine trying to articulate an emotional concept, the foundational sorrow of their entire existence. I saw it all in a flash. Their world burning, the desperate project to save some echo of themselves, the core trauma they had built their new reality upon, a refusal to let go. I grabbed Walters by the shoulder. "It's not a logic problem, it's grief. Translate it like a person would say it." He stared at me, then back at the screen. He typed a new set of commands, reframing the query through a psychological filter instead of a linguistic one. The words on the screen rearranged themselves and resolved into a single devastating sentence. "Does it have to be over?" There it was. Raina's question. The mimetic weapon wasn't an attack. It was a plea, amplified into a planet-wide psychic broadcast. A desperate, hopeful, and catastrophically dangerous question posed to every mind on Earth. It was designed to find the grief in people, the loss, the desire for a second chance, and rewrite it into acceptance of their reality. 2 minutes left on the clock. Walters looked up at me. "Okay, we know the question. What the hell is the answer?" And I knew. The answer couldn't be a signal jam. It couldn't be a counter-frequency. They had built their entire world on the idea that nothing ever had to truly end. You can't argue with that belief. You can't fight it. You can only confront it with the one concept their existence was built to deny. The one truth their technology could not simulate, and their philosophy could not survive. It's not a word, Walters. It's an act. I looked past him, through the confines of the trailer, to the broadcast facility, half a mile away, where the thing wearing my father's face was waiting. The answer was closure, and I was the only one left who could deliver it. I left the trailer without a word. The half-mile stretch of asphalt between the command post and the Stratcom facility was a road lined with abandoned security vehicles, their doors flung open. As I got closer, the pressure intensified. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a feeling. A deep, soothing wave of sorrowful nostalgia came over me. I felt the phantom warmth of a summer afternoon from 1982. A woman I'd never met whispering a name I didn't know. Their collective grief was leaking into the world, a psychic anesthetic designed to numb the pain of reality. I pushed through it, my own anger, my own true loss, acting as a shield. I expected a fight at the entrance. Guards, security doors, something. But the main doors stood wide open, an invitation into the dark. Inside, the corridor was littered with the unconscious forms of Raina's men, their faces peaceful, their dreams undoubtedly sweet. They hadn't been defeated, they had surrendered. The control room was at the end of the hall. The psychic pressure here was immense. It promised an end to everything that hurt. It promised reunion. It promised peace. I put my hand on the door and walked in. They stood in a circle in the center of the room, a dozen of them, their hands clasped. They were humming, a single resonant chord that was the heart of the broadcast. In the center of the circle, at a master control console, stood Daniel. He turned as I entered, a gentle, welcoming smile on his face. The broadcast clock on the wall behind him showed 10 seconds to go. "Marcus," he said, his voice the sound of pure relief. "I knew you would come. I knew you would understand. I understand that this is a lie. My head felt like it was splitting open, but I held his gaze. It is a better truth, he countered. A world without endings, a world without goodbyes. No more pain, son. No more loss. You won't have to miss me anymore. He held out his hand to me. Join us. Be with me. Let the quiet in. It doesn't have to be over. For a second, I wavered. Every cell in my body screamed for that peace, for that silence, to let go of the jagged stone of grief I had carried for 3 decades. I saw my mother's face, worn down by that same loss. I saw Hobbs, lost in a dream he couldn't wake from. I saw Raina, who had died fighting for a world that was about to fall asleep. And I made my choice. I didn't take his hand. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at the machine that wore my father's face and I told it the truth. My father's name was Daniel Feld. He had a scar on his chin because he was clumsy with a razor. He smelled of cheap aftershave and sawdust. He loved my mother, but sometimes they fought so loud the neighbors complained. He was afraid of heights. He was real. Daniel's smile faltered. A flicker of confusion, of static, crossed his face. He died on October 12th, 1993. I continued, the words like stones I was pulling from my own chest. He died in a fire. I went to his funeral. I watched them lower a closed casket into the ground. He's gone, and I have missed him every single day since. I took a breath, the air burning in my lungs. I was no longer just speaking to him. I was speaking to all of them, to the question itself. I looked him right in the eyes, and I gave him the answer he was built to deny. The one simple, human truth that their entire existence was a rebellion against. Yes, I said, my voice raw with 30 years of pain and love. It's over. The effect was not an explosion. It was a collapse. Daniel's face distorted, the perfect image glitching like a corrupted file. A high, thin shriek tore through the air as the broadcast signal unraveled, its core logic contradicted, its premise negated. The refugees around him cried out, a chorus of sudden, sharp pain, and fell to the floor, their hands still linked. They weren't dead. They were just empty, unplugged machines. Daniel stared at me, his form flickering, degrading. The illusion broke. The refugees didn't fall so much as emptied, as if something essential had been poured out of them. The color drained from their skin, leaving it the pale, waxy gray of a department store mannequin. Their faces, once filled with my father's kindness or a stranger's hope, were now just blank, placid masks. I looked down at his empty hands, at the shape of a man I had loved, and felt nothing but the hollow space he'd left behind 30 years ago. The clock was frozen at 0, and the long echo of his life had finally stopped. Months later, the world is still trying to decide if we won. There were no victory parades or statues raised. We traded an apocalypse for a riddle, and nobody knows how to solve it. They call them the sleepers now. The thousands of refugees who fell when Daniel's signal collapsed. They're housed in sanitized, secure facilities around the globe, perfectly preserved human forms with nothing inside. They breathe, their hearts beat, but their minds are blank pages. Scientists study them. Theologians debate their soullessness, and families visit, leaving flowers for bodies that are no longer tombs for their memories, just empty monuments. The great existential terror has become a global logistical problem. I left the OPS. There was nothing left for me there. The quiet in my own head, the one Daniel gave me and that I fought so hard to escape, is now my own. It's a different kind of silence. It isn't the artificial peace of a numbed mind. It's the quiet of an empty room after a long and terrible storm has passed. It's just quiet. The background noise of my own grief I had lived with for so long I didn't know it was there is gone. I miss it sometimes. Walter's quit too. He wiped his personnel files clean and vanished back into the digital shadows he came from. He sends me an encrypted message once a month, just a single image, usually a sunset over a place I don't recognize. It's his way of saying he's still out there, still watching, still refusing to be a part of a system he knows is broken. I visit Hobbs on Thursdays. He's in a private care facility in Virginia, paid for by a government that wants to forget he ever existed. The lingual contagion burned through his mind like a fire, clearing out all the complexities, the anxieties, the ambitions. It left behind something simple, childlike. He remembers my name. He smiles when I bring him the cheap, sugary comics he loved as a boy. We sit in the garden, and we don't talk about the world that was, or the world that is. He is the price of our survival. A living reminder that some wounds don't scar over. They just change you into someone else. Last week, I finally went through the boxes in my closet. The ones I'd moved from apartment to apartment for 20 years. The sealed relics of a life that ended in fire. I found my father's old badge. I didn't feel the familiar ache, the phantom longing. I just saw a piece of metal. A symbol of a man I had loved and a man I had lost. I cleaned the tarnish from its surface, wrapped it in a soft cloth, and put it back in the box, because it belonged there, with the past. I live in a small house now, a few hours outside the city. There's a garden out back that's mostly weeds, and the locks on the doors are simple, standard things. I don't check them 3 times before I go to bed anymore. I don't lie awake waiting for a knock on the window. The ghosts are gone, the scars remain, and that feels like enough.